The train let her off at Dunmore Junction on a Tuesday, and the station master didn't look up from his ledger when she asked about the Holt property. "North Road," he said. "Follow it until the fence line ends. You'll know the place." She knew it before the fence line ended. She could see it from half a mile out, the lean of the barn, the way the gate hung on one hinge, the yard that had gone to grass and then past grass into something harder and more permanent. A yard that had stopped being argued with. She set her bag down at the gate and looked. The house was standing. That was something. The roof had lost shingles on the east face, and someone had tacked tar paper over the gap. But the walls were true and the chimney wasn't cracked. The garden plot beside the porch was a rectangle of weeds shoulder high. The well housing was sound. The water trough beside the barn had gone green, but the boards hadn't split. She was still cataloging when the door opened. He stood in the frame without coming out. He was taller than she'd expected from the letter, and thinner, and he held himself the way men hold themselves when something has gone wrong with them that they're not ready to name. His left arm hung slightly lower than his right. He didn't offer to take her bag. "Mrs. Cray sent you," he said. It wasn't a question. She did. "You're the one who kept the Halverson place running for 3 years." He looked at her bag. He looked at the yard. He looked at some point past her left shoulder that held nothing she could see. "I don't need much," he said finally. "The house keeps itself." She looked at the tar paper on the roof. She looked at the gate behind her. She looked at him. "All right," she said, and picked up her bag and walked past him into the house. The kitchen told her more than he had. The stove was cold, but it wasn't dirty. Someone had been maintaining it with the minimum of attention, the way you maintain something you're not sure you'll keep. There was a cast iron pan hanging on its hook, clean. There was a tin of coffee on the shelf, nearly empty. There were 2 plates, 2 cups, one of each clearly unused for some time. The firebox held ash from several days ago, maybe more. She opened the draft, checked the flue by holding her hand above the opening. Good draw. The wood box beside the door held 4 pieces. She found more wood stacked under the eave on the north side. Enough for the week if she was careful. Not enough for the week if winter came early. She found a splitting maul leaning against the stack. She found, behind the barn, a stand of dead birch that hadn't been touched. She found in the barn 2 horses that were thin but not dangerously so. She found a milk cow that was overdue by at least half a day. She found 3 laying hens and 1 rooster. She found a hay mow that was down to its last quarter. She found in the corner of the barn, behind a feed bin, a child's boot, small, maybe 4 years old, the child would have been. The leather had gone stiff and the lace was rotted through. She set it back where she'd found it and didn't mention it. She went back to the house and split kindling and started the stove. He came in for supper and didn't ask what she'd made. He sat at the table and waited. She set a plate in front of him, salt pork and boiled potatoes, the only things she'd found in sufficient quantity, and sat across from him and ate. He ate steadily and without comment. That was fine. She'd worked for men who talked through every meal, and she'd worked for men who didn't speak, and she had no preference. After a while he said, "The Halverson place. What happened there?" "Mr. Halverson passed. His son came from Ontario and sold it." He nodded. He moved a piece of potato to the edge of his plate. "You have people?" he asked. "No." He nodded again, as though this confirmed something he'd already decided. She cleared the plates. She washed them in water she'd hauled and heated herself. She heard him go out, heard the barn door, heard it close again. She dried the plates and hung the pan, and went to bed in the small room off the kitchen that smelled of cedar and something she couldn't name. Something sweet and faint, like dried flowers or old lavender. And she lay on the rope bed and listened to the silence and thought about the cow. The cow needed to be milked twice a day. She would mention it in the morning. She mentioned it in the morning. He looked at her with an expression that might have been embarrassment and might have been something else. "Twice," she said. "Morning and evening. Otherwise she'll go dry on you, or worse." "I know that," he said. "I didn't say you didn't." He was quiet. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made and stood at the window with his back to her, looking out at the yard. "She was my wife's cow," he said. She waited. He didn't say anything else. "I'll take the morning milking," she said. "If you want the evening, that's yours." He took the evening. He wasn't particular about it. Sometimes he was early, sometimes late, but he took it, and the cow held and improved, and after the first week the bucket came in fuller than it had been going out. She started with the garden because the garden would matter in August, and it was only June, which meant there was still time if she started now and didn't stop. The weeds came out in great clumped masses, roots wet from the spring rains that had finally slowed. Underneath them the soil was dark and not bad. Someone had worked this plot with care at some point. Someone had composted. Someone had known what they were doing. She found the remnants of last year's planting underneath the weeds. Carrots that had gone woody, onions that had dried to nothing, the skeleton of a bean vine, still twined around stakes that had listed sideways. She righted the stakes. She pulled the old vine. She worked the soil with the fork she'd found in the shed, turning it in long rows, and she found that the rhythm of it was good, the way rhythms of useful work were good, the way they settled the part of her that was still unsettled. She had been unsettled for 2 years, since before the Halverson place. Since before that, really. Since the beginning of the thing she didn't think about during working hours, and permitted herself to think about only briefly at night before sleep. The way you permit yourself a single match in the dark, just to prove you still know what the dark holds. A man who had said he would come back, who had not. She drove the fork into the soil and turned it. That was not what she was here for. The town was called Millhaven, and it was 11 miles south on the road she'd come in on. She went in the second week in the wagon to get seed and supplies. The man at the feed store was named Renfrew, and he had the particular watchfulness of a man who trades in information as readily as in goods. "You're out at the Halt place," he said. It wasn't a question either. The district was small. "I am. He hasn't been in since March." He paused to let this mean something. "How's he keeping?" "Well enough." Renfrew looked at her for a moment. "His wife passed in November," he said. "The baby too. She counts out her money for the seed packets. I'll need a line of credit for the rest," she said. "Until the fall." "You think he'll be there in the fall?" "I think the farm will be," she said, and Renfrew looked at her again differently this time, and wrote the credit in his ledger without further argument. She drove home with the seed and a sack of flour and a tin of lard and a paper of nails for the gate hinge. She fixed the gate hinge that evening before supper. He came out of the barn and stood watching her for a moment without speaking, then went inside. The gate hung true. The barn roof was worse than it had looked from the ground. She climbed up on a clear day in early July to get a proper look, and found that the gap she'd seen from the yard was only the visible part of a larger failure. The boards beneath had softened across a span of 8 feet, and there were 2 more sections further west that were on their way to the same condition. She came down and found him splitting the wood she'd felled from the birch stand. "The barn roof needs reshingling," she said. 8 feet minimum, probably 12 once you pull the bad boards. "There are 2 more sections that won't last another winter." He split around without looking up. "I know. Do you have shingles?" "No. Renfrew carries them. I can go in Thursday." He set another round on the block. "I'll go," he said. She nodded. She went back to the garden. He came back from Millhaven on Thursday with the shingles, and, she noticed, a new hinge for the chicken coop door that she hadn't asked for and hadn't mentioned. She didn't say anything about it. She installed the hinge that afternoon, and the door stopped dragging, and the hen settled, and he didn't say anything about that either. They were learning, she thought, the grammar of this particular arrangement, subject, verb, result. No excess of explanation. July was good. The garden came up. Beans and carrots and onions and a late planting of turnips that would feed them through autumn. The cow was producing steadily. The horses filled out on good grass and oats she measured carefully. He re-roofed the barn over 3 days, working from first light, and she handed boards up to him on the ladder, and he didn't ask her to, and she didn't explain herself. On the 3rd evening, when the last course of shingles was down and he was cleaning the tar from his hands at the water barrel, she noticed his left shoulder again, the way he favored it without seeming to know he was doing it, the way he angled his body to compensate. She had noticed it on the first day. She had been noticing it all month. It was not her business to ask, but she noticed. The letter came in August. She knew it was a letter before she saw it. The way he was standing when she came in from the garden, the way the table had been cleared and the envelope set in the center of it, squared up with particular care. He was at the window again. That seemed to be where he went when there was something he didn't know what to do with. "It's from my brother in Manitoba," he said. "He has a place, larger than this. He wants—" He stopped. "He says I should come." She set the garden basket on the counter. She washed her hands. "What does he offer?" "A share in the place. Real share written down. He says I've been here long enough." She thought about the barn roof, new and tight. She thought about the garden that had weeks yet to give. She thought about the cow, whose milk had come up to nearly 3 gallons morning and evening combined. "That's not a small thing," she said. "A written share. No." He turned from the window. He looked at her directly, which he didn't do often. His eyes were gray and more present than you often, as though the letter had recalled him from somewhere. "It's not." She waited. "I haven't decided," he said. "All right. I wanted you to know." She dried her hands on the towel beside the basin. She thought about what it would mean. Another arrangement, another wagon, another station master who didn't look up. She had done that before. She would do it again if she had to. "I'll have supper on at 6, she said, and went back to the garden. He didn't go. He didn't say he wasn't going. He wrote back to his brother. She saw the letter on the table one morning, before he'd sealed it, and didn't read it, and after that the letter from Manitoba wasn't mentioned again. And he was there in the morning, and at evening milking and splitting wood without being asked when he could see the box was low. September came in cold that year, colder than the old-timers in Millhaven said it usually did. There was a frost in the 3rd week that took the last of the beans, but the turnips and carrots were already in, and the root cellar was as full as she'd been able to make it. She had made it full on purpose. He found her in October, sitting on the porch steps in the early morning, with a cup of coffee, watching the tree line to the east go red and orange, and a color for which she didn't have a name, something between copper and smoke. He came out with his own cup and sat on the top step, one step above her and slightly to the left, and they watched the trees. After a long time he said, "You knew I wasn't going." She considered this. "I thought it was possible you weren't. Before I did. Maybe." He was quiet. The trees shifted in the light. "Why did you stay?" he said, "after the letter." She thought about the turnips in the cellar. She thought about the barn roof. She thought about the small boot in the corner of the barn that was still there, exactly where she'd found it and put it back. "I don't leave things half done," she said. He absorbed this. He turned his cup in his hands. "The work is mostly done," he said carefully. "Most of it," she agreed. The morning light moved across the yard. The frost had silvered the grass, and now the sun was taking it back, blade by blade. The gate swung lightly in the east wind, true on its hinge. "There's the winter to think about," he said. "There is Asa, and after." She didn't answer that. It wasn't a question that needed an answer yet, and they both seemed to understand this. Some things were answered not by speaking, but by the accumulation of days, by presence where presence wasn't required, by choosing again and again the same difficult and particular thing. She had chosen it all summer. She had chosen it in August when the letter came. She would see, she thought, what she chose when spring came back. She was still there when the snow fell in November. She was still there in December when Renfrew's wife, a thin woman named Mrs. Vickers, who drove her own cutter and didn't apologize for it, came out to see about the church social and stayed for 2 hours drinking tea and talking about the district with the steady authority of a woman who had watched it for 30 years. After she left, he said, "She'll tell everyone you're here." "She already knows everyone knows," she said. He almost smiled. She had been watching for almost 6 months, and she had seen, she thought, 3 of them, small, contained, not quite reaching his eyes, but present. She counted them the way she counted the things that mattered. In January, he told her about his shoulder. He didn't sit down to do it. He was standing at the work table in the barn, mending a piece of harness, and she was checking the horse's feet, and he said, without preamble, "I took a log badly 3 winters ago, trying to do it alone. Neighbor found me." She moved to the next hoof. "How long were you down?" 6 weeks. She thought about 6 weeks of a shoulder unmended, and the way a man might come through 6 weeks alone and not quite come back from it the same way. "Does it give you trouble in cold weather?" "Some. There's a liniment in the cupboard above the washstand. It's better than the cold." He was quiet for a moment. "I know there is," he said. "My wife made it." She finished the last hoof and straightened and moved to the next horse without saying anything, because some things didn't require a response. They only required witness, and she could offer that much without making it into more than it was. Spring, when it came in the way Alberta springs come, reluctantly. Then all at once the snow going in great melt-offs that ran the yard to mud and brought the creek up past its banks for 4 days, and then receded and left everything washed and possible. She turned the garden in the 3rd week of April. The soil came up dark and good, better than the year before. She'd worked manure into it all autumn when the ground was still soft enough to take it. He came out one afternoon and stood at the edge of the turned rows. "You went further south this year," he said. "The drainage is better on that side. You'll get more from the root vegetables." He stood there a moment longer. "My wife used to say that." She drove the fork in and turned another row. "She didn't say anything. She said the same thing about drainage and I never moved it." He paused. "She'd have done it herself, but she was sick by the 2nd summer. And then the November that Renfrew had told her about, and then the small boot in the corner of the barn." "The soil is good now," she said. "It'll do well this year." He stood there while she worked. He didn't leave and he didn't help, and she didn't ask him to, because sometimes the only thing a person could do with grief was stand at the edge of it and watch someone else work in the middle of it. And she understood that. She knew what that was. She had stood at that edge herself more times than she cared to count. After a while, he said, "I'm glad you stayed." She kept working. "I know," she said. There was no declaration. There was no particular evening that became the evening. There was May, and then June again. And the garden was better than the year before, and the haymow was full, going into summer, and the horses were right, and the cow was right, and the hens were producing better than they had any right to, in a yard that had been as neglected as this one had been. She had a letter from Mrs. Halverson's son in Ontario. Not the one who'd sold the place, the other one, the younger one who'd gone west, asking if she might come to a property in the Peace Country that needed a woman who knew what she was doing. She read the letter twice. She set it on the table. He saw it there in the evening and didn't ask. In the morning it was still there. She was at the stove when he came in. "The Peace Country," she said. "Someone I used to work for." "I know that country," he said. "Harder winters, yes." He poured his coffee. He stood at the window, but differently than he used to. Less like a man waiting for something to end, more like a man looking at a particular thing he wanted to keep looking at. "The South Field needs breaking this fall," he said. "If we're going to put winter wheat in." She turned the pan on the stove. "Wheat?" He'd said it without flinching. She wasn't sure he'd noticed. "I know," she said. She put the letter in the wood stove that afternoon while he was out at the barn, not from obligation. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because the field needed breaking and she knew how to do it. And because the liniment above the washstand had moved 6 inches to the left from where she kept it, which meant he'd found it in the dark without asking. And because the child's small boot in the corner of the barn now stood upright instead of on its side, set there with care by hands she hadn't watched but could guess. Because some questions don't get answered with words. The smoke went up, and the letter was gone, and the morning was clear and cold for June, and she went out to the garden and started where she'd left off.